And then we got all this footage of even at the concert that there was crossfire, that some of these civilians, you could argue, were being used as human shields by Israeli forces. And then we find that, Israeli attack helicopters were firing indiscriminately. And what could you give a word on the Hannibal doctrine as well? Did that play a role in inflating some of these numbers?
Oh, I think it certainly did. I mean, the Hannibal directive was issued in 1986, so it's been around for really 35 years or so, 35, 40 years now. It's the notion that, because at one point the Palestinian militants were able to capture a handful of Israelis and trade them for hundreds or thousands of imprisoned Palestinians, the Israeli government became very concerned over the leverage any prisoners like that would provide the Palestinians. So they issued a directive that any Israeli captured by Palestinians, unless he can easily be recovered, with a high likelihood of being recovered, he must be killed, along with any of the Palestinian captors. And that's exactly what happened in some of this conflict. In other words, the Palestinians basically were very a few surviving Israeli hostages have said that, the Palestinians treated them very well. They were very respectful, very decent to them, because they wanted to basically capture them and use them as bargaining chips to get the many, many thousands of Palestinians who have never been convicted of any offense, but have been imprisoned for years, sometimes for many years, under brutal conditions in Israel, to be released. So in other words, they felt if they could capture Israeli soldiers or Israeli civilians, they could be traded for those thousands of Palestinian captives held by Israel. And the Israelis, knowing that situation, they basically apparently followed, elements of their Hannibal doctrine, which involved blasting the cars containing Israeli hostages driven by Hamas militants, blasting the buildings on the kibbutzim occupied by Israeli captives and their Hamas militants. And I mean, the eyewitnesses say, for example, that almost all of the Israelis who died in those situations died because of the high explosive shells and missiles fired by the Israeli military forces. And in fact, one Israeli official described what had happened as a mass Hannibal. In other words, a massive implementation of the doctrine that Israeli hostages have to be killed if they can't be rescued. Now, I'm not saying that was entirely involved in it. In other words, I think a lot of the helicopter pilots simply had no idea who was driving the cars. But you can see, for example, a YouTube video showing a junkyard with hundreds of incinerated Israeli cars. Those cars were not destroyed by the rifles of Hamas. They were destroyed by the Hellfire missiles that the Israeli Apache helicopters were firing. And so, I would think that's probably where the vast majority of the 364 Israeli civilians at the dance festival who were killed died. In other words, they fled the dance festival in their cars. The cars then were basically hit by Israeli missiles and they were all killed.